Ba-da-ba! Hello and welcome. Here we are at the historic Hanover Courthouse. And this place is historic because it was at the Battle of the Courthouse. This was won by the Union in the Civil War, which is what we're here to talk about today. Now, there were a lot of aspects that led up to the Civil War, but what we're going to focus on is the legislation. All of the legislation prior to the Civil War, all of the major legislation, dealt in some way with slavery, which was at the heart of the Civil War. The first thing that we'll look at is the Compromise of 1850, which was a compromise with 4 parts. 3 of these 4 parts dealt directly with slavery, and the 4th did not deal with slavery. The 4th one was that Texas would lose its border dispute with Mexico. This may have been to prevent the South from having easy access to a railway that could go across from the Atlantic into the Pacific. But that was not very focused on slavery. The other 3 were that in Washington the slave trade would be ended, and that Maine would be admitted into the Union as a free state, which would give 2 senatorial votes to anti-slavery, the North. Now, this is important because it throws off the balance. For many, many years, the Senate had been a place that was safe for the South, because the North's population, because of its industry, had been so much larger. It had all of the votes in the House that it needed to cross over with a majority. But in the Senate, it was balanced, so they could stop things that the North was trying to send in the Senate. But this broke that. Now, the third thing that dealt with slavery in this compromise was a Fugitive Slave Act. It said that the North would have to return any slaves to the South that they knew were slaves. If a slave was running away from its master and it came by your house and it asked you for help, you had to send that property back to its owner, because that's what slaves were, property. Now, the North, after the Second Great Awakening, saw that slavery was an abomination, a sin. It was not right by God. And the South, though they may have known that it was morally wrong, at least today it's considered morally wrong, to them it was the foundation of their whole system, their economy, their livelihoods, everything that made the South thrive was in slavery. But in the North, there were many who said this is totally wrong. We're not going to follow this law. And the South saw that as very hypocritical of the North, and it infuriated them. Because earlier, when South Carolina had been hit with a heavy tariff that they nicknamed the Tariff of Abominations, they had said, we're not going to go by this tariff. It doesn't help us. We're not going to go by it. It hurts us. So, the army was sent to South Carolina, and they were threatened that if they didn't comply with this law, force would be used to make them. So this, of course, upset the North that they would have this law put in front of them, and it makes the South crazy that the North won't follow it. That's the Compromise of 1850. But what we really need to focus on are those 2 votes. Because in our next thing, the Ostend Manifesto, we will see how those votes affect America. The Ostend Manifesto was an underhanded Southern politician way of trying to obtain Cuba from Spain. They said, Spain, we will give you this ridiculous amount of money for Cuba and just Cuba. Compared to the Louisiana Purchase, it was a terrible deal. But they needed it, because now that Maine was a free state and those 2 votes went to the North, they needed a new slave state so that it could balance out and they would be able to use the Senate to block legislation. But they couldn't put it in front of the Senate anymore because the Senate would shoot it down. The North would win. And the House, like I said, was already Northern dominated. So they had to go to Spain with 3 ambassadors and try to get them to sell Cuba without ever having shown it to the North. The North, obviously, did not like that. They felt like they couldn't trust the South. They felt like they were trying to undermine the North by spending all of this national money on a place that would only benefit the South, and a place that since it was bigger than most of the states, would probably be made not into only one slave state, but 2 or maybe 3. So the North was very upset that this was an option. The South was upset at the North because this is what they needed. Cuba, much like Haiti, was already set up in a plantation style. There had been sugarcane plantations and slavery already existed there from Spain. But the South couldn't get it, and that made them angry because they needed those votes. The next thing that we're going to look at